person that we always discuss is Jean Piaget. For Piaget, all of his work, right? Although we've said that it should be scientific, all of his work is based on his three children and his observations of them and detailed note taking. So it's a more qualitative sort of study. So it's not absolutely scientific, but it represented what actually happened. So it stands up to the test of reliability. Not everything, but most of it, right? Um, so we'll go through it and then we'll see. So Piaget introduced the term schema, which was the mental representation of organized processes. And schemas are developed and they change based on two. There are two ways in which it works. One is assimilation, which is when a similar information is there, like my schema, but it's not exactly the same. So my schema needs to sort of get modified slightly, right? That's assimilation. So for example, if you're a child and you see a cat and that's the only animal you know, right? And then suddenly you see a dog, then somebody tells you these are same things, these are both animals, they're not humans. Then that's a assimilatory process because it's slightly similar, but not the same, right? So you assimilate this into your schema of animals. Oh, there are two types, right? Accommodation is when you change the schema entirely when you see a new schema, a new stimuli, and you're like, oh, I never thought of this was possible. And then your schema sort of shifts. So maybe this works well in breakups. You have a certain schema of the person you're in love with, and then when they break your heart, you sort of think of them in a different light, and new information about them comes around, and you're like, oh my God, I didn't know this person was so horrible. And your schema entirely changes about them, right? So that's accommodation. Uh, for Piaget, one of the most central things was that you can only know knowledge, right? And you can only know about knowledge, and you can only know if the child has learned something if there is some action behavior associated with it. So if it's happening inside their heads covertly, you don't know, then you can't assume anything. So you have to experiment and you have to observe behavioral things, right? Um, So he had four stages, right? Sensory motor stage, pre-operational, concrete operational, and formal operational. So the sensory motor stage was further subdivided into six stages, which is from birth to the first month. The newborn baby is only indulging in reflexes, which you can sort of see. And there is, we'll get into what types of reflexes, but that's all that's happening. From the first to the fourth month, they're in the stage of primary circular reactions, which is where the baby is just engaging in simple motor behavior around their own body, right? So they might be moving their head or moving their hands or just moving their hands upwards, downwards. Okay, that's it, right? And they'll keep repeating it. And it's a habit, right? Then 4 to 8 months is secondary circular reactions, where in the cradle they have those things, no, that wind chime sort of thing that makes noise and all that, right? Uh, so they like hearing new stuff, but they like repetitive stuff. So they don't like new music and all that, but they like the old things and continuing to repeat, right? Then 8 to 12 months is an interesting point where children achieve object permanence. Object permanence is basically having memory that there was something here. So the idea is that before the 8th month, children don't have object permanence. So if you showed them a ball and then you covered it with a hanky, right? If there was before 8th month, if you put a hanky there, then they would forget that the ball existed, right? Because they had not achieved object permanence. But after the 8th month, if you cover the ball with a hanky, the child will still try and grab the ball because it knows that it has not disappeared. So that's object permanence. By that time, the child also starts having more intentional and goal-directed behavior. So their habits are more, it's broader and it's more targeted. By the 18th month, they are starting to do new stuff, right? So till this point, they're still not trying to explore so much. But after the first year, they're becoming more exploratory. It's goal directed, but the goal is to explore new stuff, right? And by the second year of age, they're supposed to have developed thought because they learn language and they can speak a couple of words probably. And they've started to have mental representations of people. So they know their parents, they know when the parent is not there, they still have a mental representation of the parent, right? They know mental representations of certain words. They know what a ball looks like, etc., etc. Right now, then you have the pre-operational stage. This is from the second year of age to the seventh year. Here, children are capable of starting to speak, and by the seventh year, they're fluent in speech. They use symbolic thought, meaning how we think that starts to develop, where they have images and words and symbols in their minds, right? That sort of are expressed through language, but even if they're not expressed through language, they are still having thoughts, right? Um, the reason it's called pre-operational is basically these are sets of actions that the child does mentally before they actually physically do it, right? So this pre-operational is right before that. So the child is at this stage existing in a space where they are behaving as well as thinking at the same time, right? For most of us, before you do an action, you'll think of all the consequences, everything, and then you'll do an action. For example, if you are to switch on your TV at this very moment, you will run through the steps before you do it. Like, I need to pick up the remote and press this button. Then you'll go and pick up the remote and press the button, right? Even if you're not aware of it, that's how you're already processing operations. But this is a stage where that operation is still developing while the child is behaving also, uh, like directly. So there is that gap is not there between thinking and decision making, basically. Um, in the pre-operational stage, there are three important things that take place. One is centration, which is basically uh, children are so focused that like they're not focused, but only one part of a stimuli can grab their attention, and they'll ignore everything else, right? So this is the age where you play peekaboo with kids, and they get really fascinated. The reason is that for them, like they when you cover your face like that, they are focused on your hands, and they've sort of, and then when you show your face, then this is a new stimuli to them, and then this is another stimuli, and this is a new stimuli, right? So centration is one of the good examples. Is if you have a child around you, or if you've ever been around kids, if you wear a mask of a tiger or something, right, the child gets scared, although technically it should know that it's your face and you're putting the child over the mask of a tiger, but the child will get scared, right? That's centration because it's focused only on one stimuli, and that's ignoring everything else and ignoring previous stimuli also, right? But if you remove it, and then they'll get very fascinated that it's your face. So that's centration, right? So children have centration at this age, and as they cross the age of 5, 6, the centration sort of diminishes. Um, Conservation is an interesting idea where children believe that certain things will remain stable, certain attributes of things will remain stable, even when shallow changes are made. So the example of conservation is what all of you know, right? You take two glasses of water, one with a large beaker and another with a small beaker, one tall one fat one, basically. Fill both with 1 liter, right? And then, or fill just the tall one with 1 liter and show the child and ask which has more water. They'll say the tall one. And then you pour that 1 liter into the long vessel, right? And then you pour another liter into the tall one and you compare the same amount of water and you see which one is more, and the child will say the tall one is more, right? Um, so that's conservation, that they have not developed that ability where the transition of certain attributes, right, doesn't change the essence level of those attributes. So in this case, the volume is not changing, right? It's just the way it looks is changing. So because they are already focused on centration, that their attention is already fixed on one part of the stimuli, they are unable to see everything else, and therefore conservation takes place, right? So they lack conservation skills, maybe due to centration in terms of volume, matter, area, length. Then they're also very egocentric, meaning that they think only from their perspective and they are not willing to take other people's perspectives into account. This you must have seen. Children at this age are quite annoying. So that's because they'll keep talking and they think they're right and I know what I'm doing types. So egocentric thought is there. Then there is animism, that is children around the age of 2 to 4, 5, they look at inanimate objects and think that they have lifelike qualities. So they'll talk to their doll, they'll talk to their dollhouse, they'll have different soft toys that they'll be talking to, thinking that it has human qualities, right? Lifelike, it's alive. Then they also don't understand irreversibility, right? That if one thing can lead to another, and that same thing can lead backwards to the first thing, that idea they don't get, right? So, for example, if say you switch off the TV with the remote, right, and the same button switches it on, that's slightly difficult for a child who's 2, 3 years of age to sort of grasp, right, according to Piaget. But today, you and I know that that's not really true. They understand it quite well. But certain kinds of irreversibility is difficult for them to understand. Like, for example, if you take something like the water cycle, right, saying that evaporation leads to precipitation, right? That the child will not understand that it works like that. Similarly, 2 minus 2 plus 2, that's supposed to be is equal to 4. and then 4 minus 2 is equal to 2, that they don't understand. Then you have concrete operational stage. This is where children become a lot more mature in the sense that their cognitive abilities improve. So they are very logical, and it's slightly difficult for them to hypothesize. So they are, if you tell them what might happen like this, very difficult for them to sort of grasp that idea that I can imagine a scenario where something else might happen, right? So abstract thinking is missing, but logical thought is present. Um, they can sort of divide things into sets. They can propose relationships between objects. They can understand, okay, if I do this, then that will happen, right? They can understand processes involved in a lot of different activities. Um, they understand how to say label things, arrange things, structure activities. Um, they understand categorization between and separation between different sorts of concepts, but they are not imaginative in a sense where they can create their own categories, right? So it's a very logical sort of life to live. Most people, according to Piaget also, most people are as adults also very concrete thinking. Okay, so it's not something that you get over, right? Some people, majority might be concrete, and then a little bit of their lives they think in the formal operational stage. But everyone, it's not like it's a stage that you cross, right? You're always existing within the concrete operational stage and the formal operational stage. Um, then they are capable of something known as transitive inference, which is understanding relationships between two objects by knowing the relationship to a third, right? So you know water, you know rain, right? And then you see steam, then you can understand that okay, these three are related in this manner. Um, so that's an interesting idea that starts to develop by the age of 10, right? Spatial intelligence is much better at this age, where you can actually play a sport, right? Before 3, 4, 5, if you played cricket with children, you'll have to roll the ball and they'll move the bat very randomly, and it's not very structured, nor is it proper, or like like how cricket is played. If you throw a ball, they might not be able to catch, and they're quite clumsy with their uh, basic spatial ability of engaging with direction. Or they'll drop a lot of stuff, they'll push stuff thing outside, right? But by the age of 12, they've sort of developed all of those things, and they remember places, locations, how to get home. So children around this age are allowed, so by the time you hit 10, 11, 12, parents also have become okay to send the child to their friend's house, to go out and play and come back, because the ability to remember stuff has gotten better, right? Then they can also engage in deductive reasoning, right? Which is premise, conclusion. Very logical thought, right? We learned in research methods. Inductive reasoning is slightly still difficult for the child at this concrete operational stage. Conservation and reversibility is possible. Then there's something interesting known as horizontal decalogy that takes place. Horizontal decalogy is basically the inability of a child to understand that you can transfer the understanding of volume or any other kind of conservation from one type to another. So there is this very interesting question that is very often asked, right? What is heavier, 1 kilo of iron or 1 kilo of cotton? Right? I'm not going to ask you to put it on the chat box, but it's the same, right? It's just the cotton will be much larger in volume, but the weight of the two will be the same. So that's the basic idea that people develop conservation skill. They are unable to sort of develop horizontal decalage at this age where that 1 kilo is same, but somehow in the cognitive framework, it gets really jumbled up and the person is not able to sort of differentiate volume from weight, right? Because most things that are heavy, that are like small in number, are not as heavy as something that is large in size, but that's a conservation problem that the child sort of doesn't understand, right? Even adults don't at times. So uh, if you thought that the 1 kilo of iron is heavier than, or the cotton is heavier, then you are also engaging in conservation mishap, right? Uh, then you have the formal operational stage. This was not something that Piaget really focused on too much, probably because his children like they stopped him from observing them because they hit puberty at this age. But his idea is that in the formal stage, abstract thought develops, which is the ability to think beyond just logic, right? And create a space where you can have a hypothetical space situation where you're having arguments, where you're having propositions, hypotheses, discussions, that sort of thing, right? So here, argumentativeness is something that develops where formal reasoning skills develop, and then the child is constantly trying to find ways in which they can sort of argue, right? Um, Egocentrism is slightly low because they can now see multiple perspectives, but they are still not emotionally suited to make decisions, right? They're still decision making is sort of lacking, but the ability to see multiple decisions has developed, right? Um, there's something called apparent hypocrisy that takes place where adolescents, uh, there'll be an ideal, right? They'll talk about an ideal, but they'll pursue something completely differently, right? This is usually, if you notice on social media, a lot of people have this sort of behavior where on social media, they'll be focused on certain kind of activism. They'll say certain things about certain kinds of lifestyle. Uh, they'll encourage certain kinds of behavior, but in real life, they may not be doing it, right? So this is something that is very often with adolescents. They'll say that, my parents are not like this, they're like that, but in their own lives, they might not be actually doing the same thing, right? So there's like a hypocrisy that is there. Adolescents also during this time go through a phase where they think that there are other people who are always sort of noticing them, right? So there's an imaginary audience that they create. So they have an observer in their own heads, and then that observer is concerned with the adolescent's thoughts and actions, and the adolescent knows that it's being noticed, right? Uh, but the adolescent is not saying that I am noticing myself. The adolescent is saying that I'm constantly under watched by people. I have an imaginary audience, so they'll behave accordingly. Then they have personal fable, which is they think that they're unique, that there's something special about them, right? And if they don't have something special about them, and if they don't think they're unique, they at least think that someday something unique will come out about me, right? Or I just have to find it. So that's another common thing that is there. By the time you reach adulthood, you're like, all of this is nonsense, right? Then you have hypothetical deductive reasoning. This is the ability to generate hypotheses and be more inductive in terms of thought process, right? In terms of evaluation, there's limited data, extreme generalization, object permanence develops early, thinking begins early, logical reasoning develops early, egocentrism after 2 years is not there, formal operations develop for most adults because they aren't as rational. Empirically, they won't much research support, but this is a very important theory because it gave us a lens into the cognitive framework of things. Okay. Piaget gave us still formal operational thought, but then there are other cognitive theorists who said that development doesn't stop at formal operational thought. There is also post-formal thought, right? Um, so post-formal thought was very interesting, where they said that uh, cognitive capabilities are not limited at just formal reasoning and abstract thinking, but as adults, there are other things to deal with, right? And it requires a higher level of cognition, which is basically dependent on things of uncertainty. So as adults, you begin to realize that around you things are very uncertain, right? And you have to be okay with that idea and cognitively develop a framework where uncertainty is accounted for when you're trying to make decisions, right? Where there is a chance that something might go wrong, and you have to take that into account. Um, so that's an interesting thing that develops. Other thing is also dependence on intuition and personal experiences. All of that affects the cognitive thought process, right? Um, the basic understanding is that their life has a lot of gray areas. So sometimes when somebody behaves a certain way, uh, post-formal thought will allow you to sort of see things from their perspective, sort of empathize with them, be okay to accept that okay, you may be wrong, right? Be okay to accept that sometimes intentions matter more, right? That sort of idea. That flexibility in thought is what happens, but again, not everybody reaches the post-formal thought process, right?